The heat in the desert was unbearable, thick with a weight that clung to your skin and made it feel as though you were suffocating even before the sun touched its highest point. The air was dry, almost as if the land had forgotten what it meant to be alive. And the dirt, a dull ochre, was stained with the blood of past wars. These were the lands we owned. The Sinaloa Cartel, the most powerful and ruthless cartel Mexico had ever known, controlled everything within its reach. From the mountains that overlooked the valley to the vast networks of tunnels beneath the cities, we ran it all. I was born into this world, not by choice, but because it was the only life available to me. My father had worked his way up the ranks, his reputation built on loyalty and blood. By the time I was old enough to understand, I was already part of the system, one of many small pieces in a machine that never stopped turning. We didn't think about why we did what we did. We didn't question the work, we just did. And in doing so, we kept the money flowing, kept the violence churning, and kept the power in our hands. It was late one night when the order came down. I was sitting at the table in the dim light of my apartment, counting the money we had moved through our channels just that week. My fingers were numb from the cash, but I couldn't stop. Not when the stakes were this high. To boss El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman Loera wasn't the kind of man to leave things to chance, and what we were about to do would put our entire operation in jeopardy. We had just hit a rival cartel shipment, a ton of pure cocaine, ready to be shipped across the border. The rivalry with the Zetas had become personal, and personal things meant a whole different level of danger. The Zetas were known for their brutality, but we had our own way of dealing with things. Our loyalty to each other was unmatched, and it was that loyalty that would decide who lived and who died. It was the night that would set everything in motion. El Diablo wants to see you, the voice on the phone told me. I didn't need to ask why. El Diablo Miguel Angel, the brutal enforcer who ran the hit squads for the cartel, was not someone you could say no to. His reputation alone was enough to make grown men break down in tears. I'd seen his work firsthand, what he could do with a knife or a gun or his bare hands. And the worst part, he enjoyed it. I arrived at the safe house, a small nondescript building on the outskirts of Culiacan. Inside, El Diablo was waiting for me. He was seated in a chair, his back straight, his eyes cold. No emotion, no expression. His fingers drummed lightly on the table in front of him, a rhythm I had learned to fear. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "One of our shipments got intercepted. We need to send a message." The way he said it, the calmness in his voice, made my skin crawl. There was something in the air that night, something that felt off, as if the whole world was holding its breath. "A message," I repeated, though I already knew what he meant. "Eliminating the problem isn't enough anymore. We need to make an example out of them," he said. "We need to hit them where it hurts, make them understand that crossing us isn't an option." The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. We would massacre anyone connected to the Zetas within Culiacan, send a warning they couldn't ignore. But it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about power. It was about control. It was about making sure that we remained untouchable. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Weapons were gathered, men were called in, and the order was given. El Diablo didn't wait for anyone's approval. He just did, and once he did, there was no going back. We moved like ghosts through the streets, our faces covered, our footsteps silent against the concrete. Each man knew his role, each man understood the stakes. No one spoke, we didn't need to. The silence was deafening, the tension thick enough to choke on. The first house was quiet, too quiet. We'd gotten there first, before the Zetas had a chance to react. We were already inside by the time they even realized what was happening. A few quick bursts of gunfire, and it was over. The blood spilled quickly, coating the walls, the floor, the ceiling. There was no mercy. We didn't take prisoners. Not that night. Each house we hit after that was the same. The stench of fear, the shrill screams, the thud of bodies hitting the ground each time. It became easier, like something inside us had already died. The massacre escalated. We killed men, women, children. It didn't matter. If they were connected to the Zetas, they were a target. El Diablo's orders were clear: leave no witnesses. By the time the sun rose over the city, Culiacan was a ghost town. The streets were littered with bodies, some mutilated beyond recognition, others left in the most grotesque positions, as if to send a message that no one could ever forget. But it wasn't just about sending a message to the Zetas. It was about sending a message to the world, and we had done that, loud and clear. That night marked the beginning of the end for me. The line between right and wrong blurred, and what had once been a game of survival became something else entirely. The violence, the chaos, it started to feel normal. The brutality of it all, the indifference to life, it became something we embraced. I wasn't the same person after that. No one who was involved could ever be the same. And little did we know, that night would mark the turning point. The start of a spiral that would pull all of us down into darkness. The morning after the massacre, the city of Culiacan looked like a war zone. The sun had barely risen, yet it felt as if the day would never truly begin. The once bustling streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional police siren in the distance. The air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and gunpowder. The work we had done the night before was still fresh in the minds of those who lived through it, or at least those who survived. I stood on the rooftop of a safe house, looking down at the city below. My hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, from the violence, from the deaths I had helped cause. They told me to stay calm, to keep it together, but it was hard. How could I? How could anyone? I watched the police begin to gather near one of the houses we had hit the hardest. The first responders were cautious, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't quite place. Something was changing, something bigger than all of us. The Zetas had been hit hard, but they weren't the only ones who would pay the price for this. The massacre had stirred something far darker than we had anticipated. El Diablo, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking several steps ahead. He had seen this kind of chaos before, and he knew exactly how to capitalize on it. By the time I returned to our headquarters, he was already on the phone, his voice low and steady. "Get the men in line," he said to me, barely looking up as I entered the room. "We need to move quickly. The Zetas won't take this sitting down, and neither will the others." I nodded, not needing to ask for clarification. There were always others. The cartels had a way of looking at each other like pieces on a chessboard, moving strategically, anticipating each other's next move. This was the game we played. But now, something was different. Something had changed. There were whispers, rumors that this massacre wasn't just about sending a message to the Zetas. It was about something much bigger, something that could tear the entire region apart. That night, the first of the retaliation strikes came. It wasn't much at first, a few low-level skirmishes, a couple of gunfights in the back streets of Culiacan. But the message was clear. The Zetas weren't backing down. They had their own methods of making sure their reputation stayed intact, and they were willing to spill as much blood as needed to prove it. The first major confrontation happened at an old warehouse near the outskirts of the city. I was there, leading a small group of men, when we heard the screech of tires on asphalt. A convoy of black trucks, heavily armored, roared into the parking lot. The Zetas had arrived, and they had come prepared. I could hear the engines revving as they parked. I could feel the tension in the air, the sense of impending violence that always hung over these kinds of operations. We were prepared, but this wasn't going to be a simple fight. The Zetas weren't here to negotiate. They had come to kill. The first shots rang out from their side. The sound of bullets tearing through the night air echoed through the empty streets. I didn't wait for orders. I fired my weapon instinctively, the sharp crack of my rifle cutting through the chaos. The sound was deafening, drowning out everything but the scream of gunfire and the rush of blood pounding in my ears. We took cover behind the steel beams of the warehouse, returning fire as we watched their men scatter like roaches. But they were fast, organized. They had the same ruthlessness we did. We exchanged fire for what felt like ours. The Zetas weren't backing down, and neither were we. Blood soaked the ground, and the stench of death started to creep in, clinging to everything. I could feel my heart racing, my body pumping adrenaline as I squeezed the trigger again and again, until my fingers were raw, until my hands were shaking. And then it happened. A loud explosion shook the ground, sending a massive shockwave through the building. I could hear the screams of my men over the ringing in my ears. The blast had come from one of their trucks, a truck packed with explosives. The Zetas were sending a message. They weren't just here for a fight. They were here to destroy. I crawled to the edge of the warehouse, trying to catch my breath. The firelight flickered around us, illuminating the carnage. The building was burning. My men were down, but we had one advantage. We were the ones with the upper hand now. The Zetas had underestimated us. I signaled to the remaining men to fall back, to regroup and get out before the whole place went up in flames. But not everyone made it. As we moved to retreat, I saw one of my men, Marco, pinned down by enemy fire. His body jerked violently as bullets tore into him, his face contorted in pain, eyes wide with fear. I wanted to help him, wanted to pull him to safety. But I knew better than anyone. There were no second chances. In our world, you either moved fast or you didn't move at all. And Marco was already gone. We got out, but the Zetas' retaliation was only the beginning. What followed was a brutal war that would engulf the entire region. Every day brought new challenges, new bloodshed. Every night, there was the constant sound of gunfire in the distance. The knowledge that someone, somewhere, was dying because of the decisions we had made. And through it all, El Diablo remained calm, calculating. The man never showed fear, never showed doubt. He was a monster, but he was a monster with a purpose, and that purpose was to win. But even he didn't know what was coming next. By the third week after the massacre, Culiacan felt like a war zone in the midst of an ongoing siege. The Zetas, as we had anticipated, weren't just striking back, they were clawing their way into our territory with everything they had. But the bloodshed, the destruction, it wasn't just them. Others, too, began to sense weakness, began to see the cracks in the Sinaloa Cartel's armor. The word on the street was that there were bigger players, more ruthless people waiting to take advantage of our moment of instability. Every night, we moved under the cover of darkness, trying to keep our operations intact. The fear was palpable. Even the most hardened men in our crew were starting to talk about what-ifs. What if we couldn't hold on? What if someone came for us next? And the unspoken question, the one that gnawed at everyone's gut, what if we weren't the ones who were in control anymore. El Diablo, as always, was calculating. But even his cool demeanor couldn't erase the tension in the air. In the months I'd worked under him, I had never seen him look so uneasy. It wasn't just the Zetas that were threatening us now. It was a much deeper, more dangerous game. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during a meeting with one of our closest allies. One of the men I had trusted, who had been with the cartel for years. His name was Juan, a man known for his calm and his loyalty. But that day, when he walked into the room, his face was pale. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his hands trembling slightly. "El Diablo wants you," he said finally, and his voice had a strange edge to it, like he was holding something back. He was shaking though, and I could see the sweat on his brow. When I got to the safe house, El Diablo was already there, seated at the head of the table, his cold eyes scanning the room. "Sit," he said, without looking up. "We have a problem." I took my seat across from him, waiting. The air felt thick with dread. This wasn't just about another skirmish with the Zetas or a raid gone wrong. There was something more, something he was still deciding whether to tell me. "You know the plazas in Sinaloa are becoming contested, right?" he asked finally, his voice low, his eyes narrowed. I nodded. The cartel had always controlled Sinaloa's trade routes, the corridors that connected us to the world's drug markets. But now, it seemed like everyone and their brother was trying to stake a claim. The Zetas were one thing, but the fear now was of a new player, someone with bigger ambitions, more reach. The enemy, whoever they were, was growing stronger by the day. "El Chapo," El Diablo said, the name hanging in the air like a death sentence, "is making moves. We thought he was out. We thought he was finished, but now he's back." The mention of El Chapo Guzman, the man who had built the cartel to its legendary status, caused my chest to tighten. He'd been arrested, sent to prison, and for a time, we thought we were free from the shadow of his reign. But the rumors had been circling. El Chapo was coming back. "El Chapo isn't the only one making moves," El Diablo continued. "There are whispers, some of our own men, loyal to him. There are cracks in our organization, and they're spreading. Some think they can take his place. Some think they can take my place." I felt the floor beneath me shift, like the ground was being pulled out from under me. The betrayal was already beginning, quietly, in the shadows. It wasn't just the war with the Zetas that was threatening us now. It was the looming threat from within, from the very men who had once pledged their loyalty to us. I spent the next few days on edge, moving through our territories like a ghost, watching for signs of trouble. But trouble, I quickly realized, wasn't always easy to spot. Sometimes, it came in the form of subtle shifts of glance from a trusted lieutenant, a change in routine, a whisper in the night. It wasn't long before we discovered that some of the higher-ups in the cartel were talking to El Chapo's men, negotiating for their own interests. I could feel the rumblings of mutiny beneath the surface, the tension of men caught between loyalty to us and their desire for more power. Some of them had been with us for years, but loyalty in this world, like everything else, was a fleeting thing. It was like watching a storm gather in the distance. You can feel it, but you can't stop it. And then, when it hits, it rips everything apart. The first defection happened late one night. We had been tracking one of our men, someone I had trusted for years. His name was Ramon, and I had always believed him to be solid. But as we watched him slip into the shadows, meeting with someone from El Chapo's camp, I knew it was only the beginning. We confronted him the next morning, dragged him into a back room. I could see the fear in his eyes, but he refused to speak at first. Then came the confession. "I didn't want this," Ramon said, his voice shaking. "But they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. El Chapo is going to take back what's his, and he promised me power. You have to understand, I can't. I can't stay loyal when they offer me everything." El Diablo, standing behind him, said nothing. He simply pulled out his knife, and with a swift, calculated motion, ended Ramon's life before any more words could be spoken. The message was clear. Loyalty was everything. Betrayal was death. We disposed of his body, and as I watched it disappear into the desert, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the first of many. The cartel was starting to crumble from within, and there was no stopping the tide that was rising. We were losing control. The collapse was imminent, and with it, everything I had known, everything I had fought for, was slipping through my fingers. The Zetas were still out there, still seeking revenge, and El Chapo's men, growing bolder by the day, were already making their own moves. Our enemies were closing in, and we were fighting on too many fronts to keep up. The violence only escalated from there. Once it started, it was like a floodgate had been opened. The betrayals came faster. The killings became more frequent. Our streets, once the heart of our empire, were now filled with the sounds of gunfire and the cries of the innocent. The city was no longer ours, and we all knew that, sooner or later, it would be the end. The days following Ramon's death were a blur. Each one felt longer than the last, each one heavier with the weight of impending doom. The desert was closing in on us, tightening like a noose around our necks. The cartel was splintering, its fractures becoming more obvious by the day. El Diablo seemed almost untouchable, but even he couldn't stop the tide of betrayal sweeping through the organization. I spent my nights pacing in the safe house, listening to the muffled sounds of our men arguing in the other rooms, trying to keep control of what was left. But control, I soon realized, was slipping through our fingers like sand. We had been betrayed, and there was nothing we could do to undo it. The men we had trusted, the ones who had pledged loyalty to El Diablo and to the cartel, were turning, some out of greed, some out of fear, and the worst part, we had no idea who was still loyal. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The echoes of Ramon's final words haunted me, his desperate plea ringing in my ears. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse. The thought gnawed at my insides, growing darker with every passing hour. By morning, I knew something had to be done. I couldn't wait for El Diablo's plan. I couldn't wait for anyone anymore. If we were going to survive, if we were going to fight back against El Chapo's men and the Zetas, we had to make our own move, strike first before we were hit again. I called together a small group of my most trusted menthos who had been loyal from the start. One, the man who had warned me earlier, was among them. I knew that if anyone understood what was at stake, it was him. He had seen how far things had fallen. El Diablo's losing control, I said, looking around the table at their weary faces. We need to act, now. We need to show everyone that we're still the ones in charge. One nodded, his eyes grim. What are you thinking? Strike at El Chapo's camp, I said, my voice low but certain. We hit him where it hurts the most. We take out his closest men, make him bleed the way he's making us bleed. They stared at me, their faces unreadable, but I saw the spark of agreement in their eyes. There was no other way. We could feel the world closing in around us, and we had to do something to push back, to remind everyone who still held the power. The operation wasn't easy. We knew we couldn't just walk in and take down El Chapo's men. They were too organized, too strong. but we had the element of surprise on our side. We struck under the cover of darkness, our movements coordinated and precise. I led the charge, my rifle in hand, the cold steel of it familiar against my grip. The adrenaline surged through my veins as we made our way to the compound where El Chapo's men were holed up. Every step we took felt like a gamble, but we couldn't afford to think too long. We reached the gates, and I signaled to my men to take cover. I could hear the distant sounds of laughter, the hum of the guards on duty. They had no idea what was coming. I raised my hand, the signal for them to move. The first shot rang out, and then the chaos erupted. Gunfire splattered the walls, a barrage of noise that could have rivaled a war zone. The men inside were caught off guard, but they weren't weak. They fought back viciously, with the same brutal efficiency that we had come to expect from the likes of El Chapo. I ducked behind a stack of crates, the sound of bullets whizzing by me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my breath quicken as I pushed forward. One of my men, Carlos, went down next to me, blood soaking the ground beneath him. I wanted to scream, to shout for him to get up, but I knew better. This was the price we paid. We fought through the compound, taking out their guards, one by one, pushing deeper into their territory. And then we found him, Mel Chapo's right-hand man, the one who had been calling the shots in his absence. He was holed up in a small room, guns scattered around him, his men dead or dying at his feet. It was over before it began. We took him alive, dragging him back to our base, where El Diablo would decide what to do with him. The man was broken, shaking with fear, barely able to keep his eyes open. He knew what was coming. Everyone who crossed El Diablo eventually knew. I stood over him, watching as he tried to compose himself. He wasn't a young man, but there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't as untouchable as he had once thought. "Tell me why you betrayed us," I demanded, my voice cold, my eyes locked onto his. He hesitated, his lips trembling as he whispered, "We weren't going to win, not with El Chapo in prison. We thought we could take control before you did." His words stung, not because they were a revelation, but because they confirmed what we had known all along. The cartel was not just fighting external enemies, it was fighting itself. We were turning on each other. By the time I returned to the headquarters, El Diablo was already waiting. The man we had captured, who had once been a powerful figure in El Chapo's inner circle, was brought before him. I could feel the tension crackling in the room. The air was thick, the silence deafening. Everyone in the room knew what was coming. El Diablo stood, his back straight, his hands folded behind him. He didn't need to speak. The knife in his hand did all the talking. The man, once a symbol of power, begged for his life, but it was pointless. El Diablo's cold eyes never wavered as he made the final cut. There would be no mercy here, and that, I realized in that moment, was the key to our survival. The loyalty we once had was shattered. What remained was something else entirely, something darker. We had become monsters. The nights felt longer as we plunged deeper into the abyss. The storm was coming. I could feel it on my skin, in my bones, heavy, suffocating, inevitable. The cartel was losing its grip on Sinaloa, and the fear of not knowing who was still loyal was becoming unbearable. The cracks had formed. Now they were chasms. El Diablo didn't talk much in the days that followed. He was always a man of few words, but this silence was different. There was something darker in it, like he was already preparing for the worst. I had never seen him this distant, this cold. It felt like even he, the untouchable, was now running on borrowed time. Juan was still with me, And though he didn't say it out loud, I could see the same unease in his eyes. We both knew things were deteriorating fast. Our men were scared. Everyone was scared. And with El Chapo's men still lurking in the shadows, I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep the peace, or if we even could. Juan was still with me, and though he didn't say it out loud, I could see the same unease in his eyes. We both knew things were deteriorating fast. Our men were scared. Everyone was scared. And with El Chapo's men still lurking in the shadows, I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep the peace, or if we even could. The report came through fast, almost too fast, but I didn't need to ask who was responsible. We were being hit, attacked, not just from the outside, but from the inside. El Chapo's men were gaining ground, and whoever was left loyal to him was making their move. I didn't waste any time. I called Juan, and within minutes, we had assembled a team. We had to track down who was behind the attack, find out who had the nerve to take out our shipment. We couldn't afford another slip-up. As we hit the streets, I could feel the tension in the air thick, suffocating. Like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The night was dark, the air humid, the scent of danger heavy in the wind. Culiacan had never felt this wrong. It wasn't just the violence that haunted the streets anymore. It was the sense of betrayal, like a poison spreading through the heart of everything we had built. We arrived at the site, a rundown warehouse just outside the city, where the truck had been ambushed. The wreckage of the truck was still smoking, the bodies of our men scattered around it like broken dolls. The blood was everywhere, painting the ground a dark, sickly red. There were no signs of the attackers. They were gone, vanished into the night like ghosts. But I could feel them. I could feel them watching us. Get the men inside. Search everything, I ordered, my voice low and steady, though my pulse was racing. We couldn't afford mistakes, not now. As we moved inside the warehouse, I found something. A single, almost imperceptible piece of paper tucked under one of the bodies. It was folded, carefully hidden. Someone had wanted it to stay out of sight. I unfolded it, my hands shaking slightly. The message was simple, written in a hurried scrawl. We are taking back what's ours. It wasn't from the Zetas. It wasn't even from El Chapo's men. Not directly, at least. But it was clear. Someone had made their move, and they had the audacity to challenge us. Whoever it was, they weren't afraid. They weren't going to stop. We made our way back to base, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that everything we had worked for was slipping through our fingers. This wasn't just a fight for power, it was a fight for survival, and it wasn't going to end quietly. El Diablo was waiting when we returned. He didn't need to hear the details. I could see it in his eyes that he already knew. He was already planning, already thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. They've made their move, I said, my voice tight. Whoever this is, they're not going to stop. We're being hunted. El Diablo nodded, his face unreadable. We'll make them pay, he said simply. The next few days were a blur of preparation. We fortified our positions, tightened our security, and made plans to retaliate. We knew we had to strike first. Whoever this new group was, they were well organized, ruthless, and willing to go to any lengths. We couldn't afford to let them get comfortable. But despite all the preparation, despite all the moves we made to protect ourselves, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Every step we took felt like we were walking further into the heart of darkness. The men we had once trusted were becoming more paranoid. Their loyalty was being tested, and many of them didn't know how much longer they could keep fighting. I started to notice the small signs, the sideways glances, the hushed conversations, the tension in the air when certain men walked into a room. We were divided, and I knew it was only a matter of time before that division tore us apart. One night, as we were preparing for another raid, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to find Juan standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I don't trust him anymore," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. I didn't need to ask who he meant. He was talking about El Diablo, and I knew it was only a matter of time before this would come to a head. The storm had arrived, and there was no escaping it. The darkness of the days that followed felt suffocating. I could feel the walls closing in, not just from the outside, but from within as well. The storm was no longer just a threat, it was here. El Diablo's grip on the cartel, once ironclad, was starting to slip, and I could see the cracks spreading wider with each passing day. No one trusted anyone anymore. Juan's warning had set the tone for everything. His words echoed in my mind, louder than the gunfire, louder than the silence that hung heavy over our base. I don't trust him anymore. It was true, I didn't either. El Diablo had been a legend, the kind of man whose name was whispered with fear, respect, and awe. But now, as the cartel fractured, as our own men began questioning everything, even his aura of invincibility was starting to fade. Power, once his true command, was slipping through his fingers like sand. And when a man loses power, he becomes dangerous in ways you can't even begin to imagine. It was late one night when I realized just how fragile everything had become. I was sitting in the dimly lit safe house, my mind spinning as I went over the latest reports more men had gone missing. Another shipment had been intercepted, and still no sign of the mysterious group who was picking us off one by one. They were like ghosts, too elusive to catch, but leaving their mark all over us. I stood up, pacing the small room, trying to make sense of it all. Something was off. I could feel it in the air. But before I could piece it together, the door to the safe house opened with a creak. Juan entered, his face tense, his eyes locked onto mine. There was something different in his expression, something colder. "It's time," he said quietly. I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. Juan had been with me since the beginning. We had bled together, fought together, and survived the worst that Sinaloa could throw at us. He was loyal, but loyalty was becoming a currency no one could afford anymore. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Juan admitted, his voice raw, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how much longer we can do this." I looked at him, my chest tight. He was right. The fight was no longer about the money, the territory, or the power. It was about survival, and we weren't sure how long we could survive under El Diablo's leadership. His methods were getting more erratic, more ruthless. People were dying because of him, and his paranoia was spreading like wildfire. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, my voice low, barely above a whisper. "We can't keep going like this," he said. "It's time to take him down, before he takes us all down." My blood ran cold as the weight of his words sank in. But even as I tried to reject the thought, I knew deep down he was right. We couldn't wait any longer. El Diablo was no longer the man we had once followed. He was becoming a liability. We began making plans in secret, under the cover of night. Trusting no one, we kept the circle small, just one, me, and a handful of others who had shown signs of wavering loyalty to El Diablo. Each one of us knew that to challenge him, to take him down, would be to sign our own death sentences if we failed. The plan was simple, yet impossible. Take out El Diablo during a meeting with the higher-ups, where he would be least expecting it. He trusted only a handful of men, and I was one of them. We would use that trust against him, strike swiftly, and eliminate him before he could make his move on us. But nothing ever goes according to plan. The night of the meeting arrived, and everything felt heavier than usual. There was a chill in the air, a tension that made every shadow seem like an enemy. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, but it felt distant, like we were in a world that didn't belong to anyone anymore. We gathered in the safe house once again, each man looking at each other like we were already ghosts. I could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else, a glimmer of hope, maybe, or a spark of defiance. They were ready. We were ready. El Diablo arrived just before midnight, his presence filling the room as he stepped inside. His eyes scanned the group, his usual sharp gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. But there was no sign of suspicion, no inkling that he knew anything was wrong. He greeted us in his usual way, short, clipped, as if the world owed him something. We gathered around the table, and I took my place at his right hand, a position I had once worn with pride, now feeling like a noose around my neck. The meeting began. I don't remember the exact moment it happened, the moment when everything started to go wrong. But I felt it. The air shifted. The quiet mutterings from the others grew louder, and then the unmistakable sound of a gunshot broke the tension. El Diablo's eyes went wide. He didn't have time to react. I looked down at the floor, and for the briefest second, I saw one's face. His expression was calm, determined. He had fired the shot. But the plan wasn't as clean as we thought. Chaos erupted in the room. Men dove for cover, guns drawn, shouting in every direction. The silence of the night was shattered as the sound of gunfire echoed through the walls. El Diablo, still reeling from the shock, tried to pull his weapon, but it was too late. The men who had once followed him, the men who had sworn allegiance to him, turned on him in an instant. The betrayal had come full circle. I didn't have time to think. I dove for cover, firing at anything that moved, my heart hammering in my chest. The men who had been loyal to El Diablo were now enemies, each one desperate to hold on to whatever power remained. In the chaos, I saw El Diablo. He was cornered, his back against the wall, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. But there was something else in his eyes now, fear. The fear of a man who realized he had lost everything. The world seemed to slow down as I walked toward him, my gun still in hand. I could hear my breath, steady and controlled, over the noise of the firefight. My fingers tightened around the trigger as I raised the weapon. And then I made my choice. I put him down. The room went silent in the aftermath. El Diablo, the man who had once ruled with an iron fist, lay dead at my feet. The storm was over, but the damage was far from done. The silence after El Diablo fell was deafening. It was as though the entire world had stopped breathing. His lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, the once mighty king of Sinaloa reduced to a bloody, broken man. I stood over him, my gun still in my hand, staring down at the face I had once followed, the face that had once inspired both fear and respect. But now, all that remained was death. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. The men who had been loyal to El Diablo, the men who had sworn to follow him to the end, were either dead or scattered. The chaos had been swift to swift. Some had managed to escape, while others were picked off in the crossfire. But as the dust settled, it became clear this was the end of an era. I looked around the room at the survivors, those who had been with me, who had trusted me enough to make this move. Their faces were tense, grim. None of us had expected it to go like this. Not so fast, not so clean, but there was no turning back now. One approached me slowly, his face unreadable. He had done what was necessary, but the weight of the moment was already beginning to sink in. "We did it," he said, his voice low. "We did," I replied, my throat dry. "But at what cost?" Juan didn't answer. He didn't have to. We both knew what was coming. The first thing I did was make sure the body was disposed of. It wasn't just about eliminating El Diablo, it was about eliminating the legacy he had built. If his death was discovered, if his men found out, it would set off a war that would tear the cartel apart. The loyalty that had once bound us together had already begun to crumble. And now there was nothing but bloodshed and power struggles left in its wake. We moved quickly, cleaning up the mess, hiding the evidence. But there was one thing we couldn't hide: the uncertainty. The cartel was now a fractured, bleeding organism, and we had just ripped out its heart. We spent the next few days in isolation, laying low, gathering our strength, and making plans. But as time passed, the pressure only mounted. The rumors spread like wildfire. The whispers of El Diablo's death reached every corner of Sinaloa, and it wasn't long before every cartel in Mexico had its eyes on us. The vultures were circling, waiting for a chance to swoop in and claim whatever was left. I knew what had to be done. We needed to stabilize the cartel, or it would implode. But the question was, who would lead now? I had been the one to pull the trigger, but that didn't mean the men would follow me. Power in this world wasn't given. It was taken, and taking it was never clean. I turned to Juan, the one man who had stood by me. His loyalty was unshakable, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't sure what came next, and neither was I. "We need to make our move," I said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us. "We can't wait. If we don't act fast, this whole thing is going to collapse." One nodded, but his expression was distant. "Who's going to lead?" I hesitated. The cartel needed stability. The men needed someone strong, someone they could trust, someone who wasn't tainted by El Diablo's blood-stained reign. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me, but there was no one else. "I'll lead," I said, my voice steady. Juan's gaze met mine, his eyes searching for something: assurance, perhaps, or conviction. He found it. "Then we move now," he said. The days that followed were a whirlwind of strategy and bloodshed. We moved quickly, seizing what we could, while the others were still reeling from El Diablo's death. The power vacuum had left everyone vulnerable, and we weren't the only ones trying to claim what was ours. Every rival cartel had their sights set on us, eager to pick up the scraps of El Diablo's empire. But we weren't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. The first confrontation came 2 weeks after El Diablo's death. A rival faction from the Zetas cartel had moved in, hoping to take advantage of the chaos. They attacked one of our strongest positions, one that had once been El Diablo's pride, and within hours, we were in full-scale war. The battle was brutal. Gunfire echoed through the streets of Culiacan as we fought to hold our ground. Men fell on both sides, their screams blending with the sounds of the firefight. It was as if the world had descended into madness, each gunshot a reminder of how fragile our survival was. I was in the thick of it, my heart pounding, my adrenaline coursing through me. The feeling of battle had always been something I had lived for, but now, in this chaos, there was no joy in it. There was only survival. By the time the fighting subsided, we had secured the area. The Zetas had been pushed back, but at a cost. We had lost too many good men, and the message was clear. The fight for power had begun. The war that followed was inevitable. I knew it was coming the moment El Diablo fell, but seeing it unfold in front of me, the bloodshed, the betrayals, the destruction was something I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just about territory anymore. It wasn't just about power. It was about survival. And as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that we were at war with not just the Zetas, but with everyone. Every faction, every cartel, every would-be kingpin had their eyes on us. But we were stronger than they thought. We spent the next few months consolidating our power. We made alliances where we could, crushed anyone who dared challenge us. But in this world, loyalty is fleeting, and with every passing day, the tension only grew. The line between friend and foe blurred more with each decision. I knew I had to stay vigilant, but even the strongest leader can't fight a war on their own. I wasn't just fighting for power anymore. I was fighting for survival, for my life, for the lives of those I still cared about. And in this world, the line between hero and villain had long since vanished. The weight of the war settled on my shoulders like a burden I could barely carry. The cartel's influence had spread, but the threat of complete destruction was more imminent than ever. We had taken control of key territories, but the price had been steep. Too many men had fallen. And yet, no matter how much power we gained, no matter how many alliances we forged, I could feel it in my bones. This was a game that couldn't last forever. The Zetas, the Sinaloa remnants, the Gulf Cartel, they were all watching, waiting, hungry for a chance to topple what we had built. But the worst enemy of all was inside our walls. Trust had become a rare commodity. The men who had fought beside me, the ones who had trusted me to lead them, were now looking over their shoulders, not just at the enemy, but at each other. They knew what I had done to El Diablo, and while some saw it as an act of necessary rebellion, others saw it as an unforgivable betrayal. It was a matter of perspective. Power, after all, is a double-edged sword. I couldn't blame them. I had taken out their godfather, their symbol of strength. There was no coming back from that. Even if I had killed him for the good of the cartel, for the sake of keeping us together, the fact remained. I had killed El Diablo, and in doing so, I had put a target on my back. It was in the early morning, just as the first light of day began to creep over the horizon, when the inevitable happened. I had been sitting alone in my office, surrounded by maps and intel, preparing for the next strike against the Zetas. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway, and I didn't need to look up to know who was coming. Juan. He entered without knocking, his face unreadable, his eyes colder than I had ever seen them. There was no greeting, no small talk, just a tense silence as he closed the door behind him. I didn't wait for him to speak. I knew what was coming. "You want to take me down, don't you?" I asked, my voice steady but heavy with the weight of what had come before. Juan didn't answer immediately. He simply stepped closer, his hands resting at his sides as he studied me. "The question isn't whether I want to," he finally said. "It's whether you've given me a choice." I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation settling in. I had known it was coming. I had always known. The loyalty that had bound us together was fragile, and now that thread was about to snap. The next few hours were a blur of whispered conversations and decisions made in the shadows. I couldn't trust anyone, not even one, and yet I had no choice but to make him my ally, at least for now. We met with the others, those who still remained loyal, the few who hadn't yet seen through the facade of unity. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I had been a kingmaker, but now I was the hunted. And even the strongest cartel in Mexico couldn't survive without trust. But we moved forward, the fight continuing. As the days wore on, the tension between us escalated. The streets of Sinaloa, once teeming with life and power, now felt like a battlefield. Every corner, every alley, held the potential for betrayal. Gunshots rang out more frequently, echoing the fear that had taken root in the hearts of the men who once followed me. We couldn't be sure who was an ally and who was a foe. It was one who made the first move. It happened late at night. We had just finished a meeting with our closest lieutenants, discussing the next phase of our attack against the Zetas. But as the meeting broke up, I sensed something was off. The men were too quiet, too still. The weight of the silence suffocated the room. Suddenly, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the compound. I turned, just in time to see one of my men crumple to the ground, blood spreading across the floor, and standing there, gun still smoking, was Juan. Juan, what the hell? I shouted, my heart racing in my chest. He didn't flinch. His expression remained cold, distant. "This ends tonight," he said. "One of us goes, and it's not going to be me." The room erupted into chaos as the gunfire continued. Men scrambled for cover, guns drawn, shouting orders. But there was no order to be had. The lines had already been drawn, and now it was clear. The war had come home. I rushed for cover, my pulse thumping in my ears. I had prepared for this moment, had known it might come, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight of Wanda, one man I had trusted, most turning on me with such cold determination. "Where a trug, hermano?" He cut it out, his voice booming through the room. "You've brought us to the edge, and now we finish it." I didn't answer. There was no point. In a place like this, words meant nothing. It was all about action, survival. And at that moment, survival meant taking him down before he took me down. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, each side fighting for dominance. My men and Juan's clashed in the corridors, bullets whizzing past, the air thick with smoke and tension. I knew the end was coming, but I didn't know how. As the fight continued, I found myself cornered, trapped in a room with nowhere to go. My heart was racing, my hands slick with sweat as I waited for Juan to make his final move. And then, there it was, a loud crash as the door burst open, and Juan stepped inside, his gun pointed directly at me. "This is it," he said, his voice cold and final. "You should have known this day was coming." I didn't wait. I couldn't. I lunged at him, my own gun drawn, and in that moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The world around us disappeared as I fought to survive. The shot rang out. The final blow came swiftly, but not without its cost. The room was filled with the sound of gunfire, of men dying, of power slipping away. But in that moment, as I stood over Juan's body, I knew one thing for certain: it was over. The battle for the cartel had ended, but the cost was unimaginable. The Sinaloa Cartel, once the most powerful criminal empire in Mexico, had fractured beyond repair. There was no going back from what had happened. The bloodshed, the betrayals, the endless cycles of violence had all come to an end. But at what cost? The streets were quieter now. The rumors of a new cartel rising in the vacuum left behind were true, but it wasn't mine to lead anymore. I had survived, but I was no longer the king of Sinaloa. That title was left to someone else, someone who had been waiting in the wings, ready to pick up the pieces. As for me, I walked away, not out of victory, but out of necessity. The fight had consumed everything I once held dear. It had cost me more than I was willing to give. I left the world of the cartel behind, but it would never leave me.